As I said last week, today we're going to finish our little series on local acts. And we're going to do so by looking at Stephen. Luke describes Stephen's character in detail. And Stephen's speech is the longest recorded speech in Acts. We saw last week he was set apart to help with allocating food to the widows. But from chapter 6, verse 8 to the end of chapter 7, actually a little bit in chapter 8 you could argue, we have this detailed description of Stephen, his response to the council leaders, and an account of his death, including his response to those who stone him. This incident, Stephen's death, is a turning point in the book of Acts and the early church, as it goes from a Judean focus to a Gentile focus. That is, the focus is around Jerusalem and local to wider. And we see the death of Stephen as a key beginning in the persecution of the followers of Jesus and the growth of the church. For as the church scattered, scared of what was going on, perhaps, they shared the gospel wherever they went. John Stott sees this as the very beginning of world mission. He, along with others, sees Stephen's preaching and spirit-inspired defense before the Sanhedrin, that's the council of appointed leaders, the Jewish opposition aroused by it, as a key event. So please, in your own time, because we don't have time this morning, we wouldn't have time for the whole day, to really go into depths of this and of Acts. Can I encourage you to read the rest of it? But for this morning, I just want us to look at a few verses, a few words of Stephen, and how they compare or reflect the life and words of his Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Just like a description of a car is not the same as the car itself. And the description, or just like going along to watch the football can be fun, it's not the same as participating in it. Yes, you can still enjoy it. We can be a reflection of what God has done, and it's good, but it's not the same as Christ. Communion table didn't quite look as good as that. Maybe next time. So I've entitled this, Who is Our Example and Guide? Seeing Jesus through the life of Stephen. So a super quick overview of Acts 6, verse 8 to the end of 7. So who's Stephen? He's a person who performs signs and wonders. In his life, opposition to him arises. They could not stand against Stephen, the wisdom the Spirit gave him. He was falsely accused of blasphemous words against Moses. He shone like an angel in the Sanhedrin. These are all in these verses. You can look them up. And he gave this historical account of Moses and how Moses points to Jesus. He showed Israel's rebellion and accuses them, the Sanhedrin, the leaders, of doing the same. And then towards the very end of his life, he looks to heaven and says he sees Jesus standing by the Father as people drag him out to stone him. I have these verses we want to look at, an example that we see in Acts 7, and then the real example that we see in Luke. See, in Acts 7, in verse 59, it says, as they stoned him, Stephen prayed, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Now, it's really encouraging for people. If you think you should do something and you do it, and then you look at an expert and they say the same thing, that's what I did when I was reading this. I was like, oh, as I was reading this, I'm sure I've heard it before, but I'll claim it was just me this time. I mean, Lord, receive my spirit. Those verses, that phrase sounds familiar. You know, Stephen is affirming not just his faith in Jesus, as he has already done, but his belief that life will continue after death. And what I found interesting is the similarity his words are to those Jesus spoke. When we look in Luke, which are also up there, Jesus called out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And when he said these, he breathed his last. Stephen is an example we can look to. And he would tell us to look at the real example, which is Jesus Christ. If I was in the midst of being accused of something that I hadn't done, of being stoned for something I didn't do, I doubt my response would have been the wonderful example we see in Jesus, or the wonderful example we see in Stephen. Acts 7 continues on verse 60. It says, he, Stephen, fell to his knees shouting, Lord, don't charge them with this sin. I doubt I would be saying that. And with that, he died. Falling to his knees is not a sign here of respect for the Sanhedrin. It is either a posture of prayer or the result of him being stoned. We're not too sure. Either way, he was aware his life was coming to an end, and he cries out to God, Lord, don't charge them with this sin. How did he do that? How did he know? How could he cope in that situation? I think, just as he is an example, he knew the ultimate example that we too, and that is Jesus, after being hung on a cross and in the process of dying, Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. It could also be following Jesus' teaching in Luke 6. You know, Stephen would know this. In Luke 6 we read, but to you who are listening, Jesus was saying, to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. Lord, don't charge them with this sin. Love them. We could finish this morning with, he breathed his last and fell asleep. A peaceful description of a violent death. But I have a couple of things I want us to at least consider. Is Stephen a formula for us or an example? He was talking to the council, but showed no fear and wisdom and clarity. Stephen was fearless. Was he? Was Stephen fearless? Or did he just have a greater understanding of who God was, who God is, and having a fear, a healthy fear and awe of the God of all humanity? And the other question I have to ask is based on the story of Stephen. But before we answer that, I want us to think about our lives. What do we hold dear? What is valuable to us? What can lead us to live this radical life that Stephen did? A true love of Jesus, an understanding the Bible points to Jesus, and the example of others. They all help us to lead this radical life. How are we going to reach others? What are we prepared to do, lose, for the sake of others? Are we prepared to step back even just to let others come first at the table? Or are we going in first? Are we prepared, like my friend, to open up his home? Yes, it is to his family. But to make this sacrifice for others. What comes first? Is it our job, our reputation, our happiness, our security, our health, our time, our comfort, our possessions, our experiences? What comes first? I read an article that was written in 2017, and it said, there's a study that shows the most valuable commodity is in that list for people in our society today. What is it? Yep. Time is the most valuable commodity. Some of us are willing to sacrifice other things, but not our time. I put my hand up. Occasion. Think of it another way. Thanks to taxes, insurance, and other costs, this is what the article said, that thanks to taxes, insurance, and other costs, your 40-hour working week, if you work 40 hours, might only generate 20 hours worth of spending. Let me explain that if you don't understand it. If you work and you get paid, then by the time you've paid taxes and insurance and other things, the money you have left over is only able to buy you 20 hours worth of spending, is what they have suggested. So everything you buy is actually costing you 50% more than you think it is. Yikes. But do we need all those things? I'm not sure. Time. And what is the greatest example of time? Life itself. Christians, people who claim to be followers of Jesus, often want to be comfortable. I know I do. Thus, they resist change. The closer we get to God, the more uncomfortable we may become. We may give of our resources. We may even sacrifice experiences for others. But for a large proportion of our society, the thing we value most is time. Are we willing to lay down our time for God? I'm not going to insult you by giving examples. You are capable of filling it in. Fill in the will I give up. Time. Stephen gave up time. He gave up his life for God. The final part of this retelling of Stephen's life is something many of us will know. It's up on the screen there. And I find it so profound because it's not actually about Stephen. It says in Acts 7, his accusers took off their coats and laid them at the feet of a young man named Saul. We go to Acts 22. Saul has now become Paul. And he reports back, After I returned to Jerusalem, I was praying in the temple and fell into a trance. I saw a vision of Jesus saying to me, "Hurry, leave Jerusalem, for the people here won't accept your testimony about me." "But Lord," I argued, "they certainly know that in every synagogue I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you, and I was in complete agreement when your witness Stephen was killed. I stood by and kept the coats they took off when they stoned him." This part of Acts, as I have already said, is a turning point from local to the wider. It is also the introduction of Saul, Paul, who will become central in Acts. But whether we love the story of Stephen or we love the story of Paul, they are great examples, but they are just examples. The real thing is Jesus. Paul, who will become central in Acts, spreads the good news into the world. I don't think Stephen was thinking as he shared or as he prayed and breathed his last, "What example am I giving to that young man?" I'm sure he didn't think that. Rather, I think he knew his priority was Christ and everything else flowed out from that. What example are we giving? What example are we being to others? Let me pray. Father, thank you for the life of Stephen and the example that he is to us. Thank you that his life impacted Paul, who has impacted so many. And yet both of them are just examples, mere reflections, minor reflections of you. May we, like them, be a reflection of you. May we point others to you. May we share in the beauty and the love that you have given us, and may we point others to that as well. Father, be with us and help us. Help us. Help us share time with others so they can see you. Help us stop hearing about it, so to speak, looking from the outside. Help us get inside and start living. Amen. We're going to finish.